Hi everyone, welcome to your PowerPoint on theories of emotion and expressing emotion. It's important to start out understanding the definition of emotion. There's three components. There's your thought process or your cognitive component, which is unique to you, so therefore subjective. There's the bodily arousal, so that's your physiological component, like your pounding heart. And then there's your expression, the facial expressions that you make or how you react. This leads to the question that's been posed by others. Your heart is pounding. Is that because you're afraid? Or are you afraid because you notice that your heart is pounding? It brings us into the three major theories that you guys need to know. The first one is called the James Lange theory. This was proposed by William James and also a man named Carl Lange, but not at the same time. They didn't collaborate on it. It just happened that they had a similar idea at the same time and both were credited with the theory. This theory has greatly been disproved. The idea is that the physical causes the emotion. So in other words, you have something like a pounding heart and then you experience fear. We see later in the 1980s, Paul Ekman actually showed that some of this with the facial feedback theory is correct, that by making certain facial expressions, it can elicit certain emotional responses. So a small amount of this is correct, and we will talk about facial feedback theory in a little bit later. One of the biggest criticisms comes from Cannon, and Cannon will later have what's called the Cannon-Bard theory. He basically stated there are people who can't actually have the physical responses, but still have a full range of emotion, that our internal organs don't respond quickly enough, or at least not as quickly as our emotions do, that there are very similar physical responses to a variety of emotional responses. And we can get your heart pounding and still not produce fear. So we can stimulate those visceral organs, but not necessarily produce emotion. Here's just another way of looking at the James Lange theory, but just read through it really quick. First, you have a stimulus. There's a man in the parking lot. This theory states, I'm trembling and I'm running away. I'm having my physical change. And then I have my experience of emotion. The physical experience leads to the emotional experience. Cannon-Bard said this doesn't work, and that emotional experiences happen simultaneously, and that is the biggest word, simultaneously, but completely separate from the physiological or the autonomic nervous system. So your thalamus sends signals both to your muscles and your emotional centers at the same time, but they actually work as independent events. So anytime you're looking for a Cannon-Bard, you're looking for something that is a simultaneous experience but independent from each other. So physically, I'm shaking and I'm experiencing the emotion of fear or I'm scared. They're happening at the same time, but they're not happening because one is causing the other. It's a simultaneous reaction. Same situation, there's a conscious emotion. I am afraid. And then there's the physiological arousal. I am trembling. So I am afraid and trembling, but one doesn't cause the other. This leads us into the third major theory, and there will be a couple more, but these are the major ones. And this one's known as the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory. Sometimes they'll shorthand this and call it the Schachter-Singer theory, and sometimes they'll call it the two-factor theory. But it's often just easier to remember Schachter-Singer two-factor theory. This theory has to do with cognition. In other words, this theory states that we do have physical arousal. So physiologically, our heart might pound, our palms might sweat, our eyes might tear up. That we also have experiencing expressive behaviors like cringing or smiling. But we also have a cognitive experience, and how we think about the events impacts the emotions that we feel. So we have a physical experience, we think about the physical experience, and then we select the correct emotional experience for that. And it's not a long process, it's a rather immediate process. But the cognition leads to the correct label of emotion. Same situation here. There is the stimulus, the thing that's causing all of this. So physical arousal, I'm trembling. Cognitive label, I'm trembling because I'm afraid because that's somebody I don't know and I'm in a dark parking lot. Then I'm aware that I'm having fear, that I'm afraid. This by far is my favorite way to remember these three theories separately. And I believe the flowchart really does work well. So, cars coming down the middle of a road. You can't go left, you can't go right. You're about to get into a head-on collision. James Lang would sit there and say, arousal then causes emotion. Canon Bard would say, you have the arousal while simultaneously having the emotion. Schachter two-factor says, you have the arousal, you think about, oh my gosh, this could be really bad and I'm going to die, and then you have the emotion. This leads us into Zajonc and Lazarus. Now, Zajonc believes that some of our emotional reactions don't actually have deliberate conscious thought, and that it's not always necessary for every emotion. In fact, he calls it kind of like a dirty processing. Sometimes information literally goes straight to the thalamus and then to our amygdala, so we can feel emotion and almost kind of react accordingly without having to fully process it. We know how we feel about a situation before we think about the situation. So imagine you're raking leaves and you hear a rustle and it's not coming from you. You are going to feel the emotion before you can actually determine whether or not it was the wind or a snake that caused it. People can develop an emotional preference for stimuli to which they have unknowingly been exposed. In other words, you don't have to have the experience to have the emotion. So he believed that sometimes emotions will actually precede our thought process. I like this slide because of the googly eyes, but essentially what you have is the stimulus of the snake is processed through your visual system. Instead of it going to your visual cortex and you kind of interpret and then send it on to higher cortical areas, the visual stimulus obviously goes to the thalamus first. It has to. At this point, it is sent directly to the amygdala, that emotional center, and you have your fear response. It will then take the longer pathway to the visual cortex, and the visual cortex will later inform you're afraid because you're about to encounter a very dangerous snake. This shortcut enables us to have that instant response of fear, and it should hopefully, in really kind of life-threatening situations, protect us. That brings us to Lazarus. And Lazarus has what we call cognitive appraisal theory. Now, he didn't really agree with Zajonc. He was a little bit more in line with the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory because he believed that cognition had to be present. But here's the big difference. He felt that while cognition needed to be present, it could actually be at an unconscious level. In other words, we may have thought about what it would feel like to encounter a snake while raking leaves, and because we had thought about that, we probably also figured out what emotion we would label it with. And so when encountering that situation, we already knew the correct emotion to have without having to consciously think about it. So he always posited, how else would we know what we're reacting to? How would we have a correct reaction to an instance unless we had thought about and actually kind of pre-programmed ourselves for that emotion? So when we're looking at Lazarus and the Schachter-Singer versus Zajonc, Schachter-Singer and Lazarus, you have the event. Then you move up to appraisal, a cognition about it. Then you have an emotional response that then comes into the three different aspects of emotion. Now, the appraisal difference between Lazarus and Schachter-Singer is that Lazarus says that the appraisal may be at an unconscious level, where Schachter-Singer says that it's a conscious appraisal. Zajonc, however, says the event goes straight into the emotional response, and then we have all of the experiences that come with an emotion. You should know the two dimensions that are described for emotion. It's going to be low and high arousal. Think of those as expression, like a lot of expression or not a lot of expression. And then unpleasant and pleasant valence. And those are really just kind of thinking about good and bad emotions. This is what the two dimensions of emotion looks like. So if it's positive valence, good emotion, and high arousal, it might be somebody who looks joyous. If it's positive valence and low arousal, it might look like somebody who's just chilled out. If it's negative, think kind of less desirable emotions. You have someone who has a negative valence and low arousal. Maybe they're very sad. Not super active, but really just kind of the opposite of chill, just really, really sad. You could also have high arousal, very active emotion, but negative, and that's where you might see something like fear and anger. You want to know the two dimensions for this. The cognitive component for emotion continues on. And we do think about emotion. We have 550 words plus in the English language for emotion. And emotions are subjective. For one person, they feel joy, and another person, they might feel amusement or maybe even just kind of mild happiness. And while we would say that those are in the same realm of emotion, they express themselves differently. Our appraisals of events determine how we emotionally react to them. It is important that when you're looking at your emotions, that you remember that our autonomic nervous system plays a big part in emotional regulation. Your autonomic nervous system is a subdivision of your peripheral nervous system. Your peripheral nervous system includes your somatic division and your autonomic division. The somatic division of the peripheral nervous system actually branches out into your afferent and your efferent nerves, essentially your reflex arc. Your autonomic goes into your sympathetic and your parasympathetic branch. Now, we talked about this way back when we were talking about the nerves in the brain. But just remember, sympathetic doesn't mean sad. Sympathetic means, can you sympathize with the situation? So if a tiger is chasing you, your sympathetic system would go, let's go into fight or flight. Let's start throwing some adrenaline around. Let's up the glucose. Let's make sure that we have energy, lots of oxygen. Let's shut down any system that's not necessary. Let's make our vision big. Gets you ready for action. Your parasympathetic acts like your parachute. It brings you back down to calm. Again, we're just looking at the general structure of the brain. The amygdala can be found on both sides of the brain. You have a left and a right. And again, depending on who you're talking to and their theory, it can provide quick and dirty processing for emotional stimuli. It can allow us to act involuntarily to some danger. And that really is almost the crux of Zajance's theory. Here again, you're looking at the autonomic nervous system. There's a big difference between the tiger attacking you and the kitty cat. It is important that you guys understand that certain things increase in activity and other things decrease. So things like your digestion, that's not going to help you survive a fight or flight instance. So it's going to slow down. It's going to turn off until your parasympathetic division calms down, and then it tells your digestive system to kick back on. But things like your heart rate should increase to pump glucose and oxygen through your body. Your respiration should increase to increase your oxygen intake. Your skin will probably start to perspire, keeping your body cool, and as you calm down, it will dry. So all of those things are going to either activate or deactivate depending on what state you're in. There is something called the galvanic skin response, and sometimes it is going to be shorthanded as GSR. Now, if you watch a lot of crime shows, they talk about GSR. They're actually talking about gunshot residue, so make sure you keep these two separate. They're very different. Your galvanic skin response is literally the electrical conductivity that exists in your skin. And so this actually shows an increase when your sweat glands increase their activity. This is what allows us to use the electronic touch screens on smartphones and iPads and any really touch screen activity. It registers the slight electrical conductivity in our skin. This is incredibly sensitive to autonomic arousal. So anything that brings you into a fight or flight state also increases that. And they use this to measure emotion in laboratory studies. That last part, very important to remember. We've looked at the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And if you remember the Yerkes-Dodson curve, it actually was just a nice bell curve. And I would tell you guys, if we're looking at performance versus arousal, moderate is perfect. We just want moderate arousal. But I did show you guys in class that it does depend on what task we're talking about. Very difficult tasks, you want your arousal to be lower so you can focus. Very easy tasks, if you want your performance to be best, you probably want a little stress involved so you actually feel like you have to focus. So anything that's easy or well learned, you can up the arousal for it. You can do it under a lot more stress. If it's something that's really difficult and requires a heavy amount of concentration, you want to lower the arousal for peak performance. Different physiological states will accompany different emotions, and some of them share similar states. So fear and rage, your finger temperature and your hormone secretions actually differ. But negative fear and positive excitement, you actually have the same heart rate. Pounding heart because you're fearful, pounding heart because you're super excited. They also differ in versions of muscle tension recorded above the eye. So think of the way you would scrunch your eyebrow together if you were showing fear versus how you might open your eyes up wide if you're excited. Disgust and other negative emotions are more often processed in the right hemisphere. Positive emotions, like talking, more often in the left hemisphere. While this isn't necessarily true, you can tie in the fact that it might help you to remember that sometimes we talk about our emotions to feel better. So if you can kind of think of that, think, I talk and I feel better. Good emotions are being activated in the left hemisphere. That's where our language is activated. Now, again, like I said, that's not necessarily the case, but it's not a bad way to remember that they're both left hemisphere abilities. When we talk about nonverbal communication, we read facial expression. So we read fear and anger mostly from the eyes, how we scrunch our foreheads, and happiness from a smile at the mouth. People who are introverts tend to be better people watchers, and so they read emotions better. They're not always in the fray, they're kind of to the outside, while extroverts are often much easier to read. They wear their emotions on their sleeves. We are also finding that women tend to be better at reading emotional cues, but this makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Women would have had to be able to register and understand the emotional cues of nonverbal children, infants and young kids. So reading facial expressions might be something that we're just a little bit better set up to do. Now, that doesn't mean men don't do this. It just means that women might have an advantage in this. Women react more visibly to emotions, and I love the Kring and Gordon film studies just because it explains so much television viewing experience with my husband. Doesn't matter what I'm watching, and it's usually happy or probably like scary. I will, especially with happy, I will laugh out loud. I will double over laughing, and I can look at my husband and he will literally give a light chuckle. And in my head, I'm going, aren't you finding this nearly as funny as I am? And in many cases, he thinks it's hilarious. He's just not as overtly expressive about his emotions as I am. And it really goes across the board. When I'm sad, it's visible. When I'm scared, it's visible. When I'm happy, it's visible. Regardless of the emotion, women are freer to express emotions. Women and men differ at the emotions that they express best. Women are really great at expressing happiness. Men, however, are better at conveying things like anger. Be careful with email communications or text or anything else because they can lack a lot of the nonverbal cues and they can be misinterpreted. We've tried to make up for that with emojis, literally bringing emotion into our text life. The only problem is that sarcasm doesn't always read very well. And I've actually watched people lose friendships online because what they thought was them being funny was read as them being cruel or mean. And you would have never known that had you not had the conversation with them. So I talked to them and they're like, nope, trying to be funny, but without literally the inflection, the facial expression, it's very hard to read the emotion that they meant to convey in their whatever they wrote. Meaning of gestures vary widely within cultures or between cultures. So what might be a very cool peace sign here in the United States is a really mean up yours in the UK. So just, again, nonverbal communications and gestures, they're different within cultures, or between cultures, sorry. When we look at culture and expression, we get to studies that were done predominantly by Carol Izard, but also Ekman and Friesen. And we look at this and they showed people facial expressions in different parts of the world, and the result was that people recognize the emotions. Cultures tell us what emotions we can display, and we often learn these very early on. They're part of our socialization process. So children learn to exaggerate, minimize, or even hide emotions based off of their culture. Expression of emotions depend on the situation and often who is present. So just think of the time that you maybe did something embarrassing and tried to walk it off or pretend it didn't happen. It might be because other people were there. And especially depending on who the person was that you either embarrassed or may have hurt yourself in front of, you may have played up a certain emotion to convey a certain message. Facial feedback theory. Now, this theory is interesting because it actually seems very much like the James Lange theory. And it says that facial movements or expressions can impact how we feel emotions. And I've run this pencil experiment in class before. If you hold a pencil between your teeth and you read things that are not really funny, like the old Sunday cartoons, but some of them are kind of humorous, you will find that students actually find them funnier than what they probably are. And you can actually run another group at the same time and have them hold the pencil between their nose and their upper lip. And this causes a frowning kind of facial expression. And those students actually report the exact same comments as being even less funny than what they were. So we may actually associate facial expression with emotion. Here is the expressing of emotion, and these are culturally universal expressions. In A, and again, if you ever have a problem trying to figure these out, make the expression yourself. A is joy, it's happiness. B, that's surprise. C, that might be concern or worry. D, we're looking at someone who is sad. E, this is probably frustration or anger. And then you get to F, and that's disgust. In the handout you guys have, you have the universal expression link. Go watch that. It'll tell you how Matsumoto actually did this research, building off of Izzard's earlier research. So looking at facial expressions, they helped us adapt by allowing us to communicate our internal states. Universal occurrence of facial expressions and emotions, these basic emotions are facial feedback. So again, remember the facial feedback theory is that we can adjust our facial expression, but again, facial feedback, we read faces, they kind of tell us what's going on. Infants show facial expressions without teaching. So we know this from blind infants. Looking at infants who never had any chance to mirror the physical or facial expressions of their parents still show the same basic expressions: joy, disgust, anger, sadness. They show the same facial expressions, which allow us to assume that without visual experience, they have to be innate, they have to be inborn. And again, that feedback, facial expressions can amplify and regulate emotions. When it comes to detecting and then also registering authentic emotion, we know that a smile that lasts for more than 4 to 5 seconds doesn't feel authentic. And so people who aren't even trained are able to detect a fake expression. So trained in recognizing subtle signals, most people find it difficult to detect deceiving expressions. However, some things just exist longer than they should. So a 4 to 5 second smile, depending on the context, might start to seem false. Ekman and O'Sullivan looked at this and they said, all right, well, we have people who are trained observers. Their entire job is to watch facial expression and to detect people. They looked at 6 groups of people and pretty much everyone fell right at chance, a 50-50 chance that they would get the idea of what the person was experiencing or the emotion correct. The only people that did just slightly better than chance were U.S. Secret Service agents, but it was only by 64%, which essentially tells us we're really no much better at doing this than really anyone else. It's important to look at lie detectors. Now, lie detectors or polygraphs are not used in criminal justice. And usually the first thing that people point to is that it's because it labels innocent as guilty, and we can't have that kind of test. They're about 85 to 90% accurate, so they are used in civil litigation at times, and it's still fairly accurate. The biggest problem with this is that it measures physiological responses, and we already know that we have a lot of physiological responses that are similar for different emotions. So this cannot distinguish between anxiety, fear, irritation, or guilt, because it's going to maybe have the same blood pressure change, the same breathing, the same heart rate. Again, here we're looking at the judged innocent by the polygraph versus the judged guilty by a polygraph. If we're looking at innocent people, most innocent people are judged innocent, but there's a pretty substantial amount that are judged guilty. Even better are the guilty people who are correctly judged guilty by the polygraph. But again, it's not as accurate as we like, so there's a certain chunk that makes them innocent. And we just have not made this an admissible piece of evidence into our court system yet. So I told you guys about Matsumoto, and hopefully you watched the video. And again, he recognized 7 emotions: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise, and contempt. And Izzard in 77 said that there were 10 basic emotions. You do not need to memorize all of them, but I would say with Matsumoto, have a general idea of what his 7 were, and you'll be okay for Izzard. Some of the major emotions that we do talk about, one being fear. We'll also talk about anger and aggression. So when we look at fear, it's an adaptive response. It's fight or flight. And you can learn fear, literally a relatively durable change in a subject's disposition due to experience with the environment. That kind of learning, the psychological version of learning, not the I sat in class and encoded information and retrieved it from my long-term memory. So classical conditioning, you might have a phobia of dogs because once when you were little you got bit by a dog and now you fear all dogs. And you should be able to tie classical conditioning into that. Literally the idea that the bite causes fear, the bite was tied into dogs, now all dogs cause fear. You can learn by watching other people. So you may have seen your parents freak out about something, and that causes you to feel fear. You could even potentially be operantly conditioned for fear, being rewarded for avoiding or fearing something. There is something called the biological preparedness hypothesis. Now, while this isn't spelled out, it's because we talked about it when we were talking about behaviorism, and especially when we were talking about conditioning. This hypothesis says that you have a greater chance of having a phobia or a fear for something that would have allowed you to survive in ancestral times. So a fear of snakes is a pretty common fear, but it makes sense because it would be life preserving. We also look at the role of the amygdala in fight or flight. Just talked about phobias. And some people are just a little more sensitive to fear than others. Some people are a little more emotionally reactive. Here again, you have the activation at the thalamus. So the thalamus takes in the sensory information. It routes it to your amygdala while simultaneously stimulating the endocrine system, which is your hormonal system, your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight, and then kind of keying in your visual system, letting you know what you just saw. Anger is a little different. And again, anger is still going to be controlled by the amygdala, but also the hippocampus, because we can remember things that often make us very angry. This, just like the previous example with fear, can be classically conditioned. Same thing with observational learning. But the interesting thing with anger is that there are some things that just cause the average person to get really angry. So one is frustration, the inability to achieve a goal. Something is standing in your way. Frustration often leads to aggression, and we'll actually talk about something called the frustration aggression principle when we get into social psychology. Crowding. Not crowding as in like you're at a baseball game and you're in a loud crowd, but like getting onto the metro and getting jostled and shoved because there's no space or you feel like you can't breathe. Extreme temperatures. Too hot or too cold makes us agitated, but too hot really, really works on our nerves. Aches and pain. People who are actually in pain, people who are suffering, are often going to be a bit more angry and aggressive. And then I always find it funny, but foul odors. When things stink, we get mad. There are cultural differences for anger. So individualistic versus collectivist. Individualistic, we feel that the individual has a right to their anger. And again, individualistic culture puts the onus on the individual. If they want to be angry, they also have to deal with the consequences. Collectivist cultures don't necessarily find anger as beneficial because anger is going to break down the cohesiveness of a group. So in many Asian cultures that are often collectivist, anger and aggression are traits that they don't appreciate because they don't help the entire group. Other biological parts of anger and aggression outside the activation of the amygdala and the hippocampus, testosterone, and having more testosterone makes it more likely that you will be aggressive. That doesn't mean that it is a predisposition to be violent. It just means that you have greater access to that emotion. When looking at twin studies, we also see a biological component that twins seem to show the same kind of traits. If one seems to be more reactive to anger and aggression, the other one does as well. When dealing with anger, we used to have something called the catharsis hypothesis, and it was the idea that by venting anger, or even better, by watching somebody vent their anger, that the viewer was then going to release their anger and their tension. And this evolved later into give someone a foam baseball bat and let them hit a pillow. And it does. It can actually temporarily relieve you of your anger and aggression. The disadvantage to this is that it may actually reinforce anger. So the good sensation of the anger leaving and getting rid of it, the next time you get angry, you may also express more anger to get rid of the anger, and you can start to see how this builds. So catharsis isn't the best way to deal with aggression. In fact, the best way to deal with aggression is to express the opposite. If you feel angry or aggressive, show helpful or socially beneficial behaviors. That's hard to do, but that actually shows greater change in the person's emotional expression. A couple of things with happiness. First off, we have something called the feel good, do good phenomenon, and I like this one. This is when someone does something nice for you and you're in a good mood, you're more likely to be helpful and help someone else in a good mood. So this is the pay it forward in the Starbucks line. You go up to pay for your drink and you find out that the person in front of you paid for you, so you feel good and you're like, you know what, I'm going to do that for the car behind me, even if they have a bigger tab than mine. This is pulling out into heavy traffic and someone lets you out, and so you don't have to try to like jam your way in. And the next time you come up to a parking lot that has someone trying to get out, you're like, you know what? I'm going to let them out as well. So literally, we're more helpful when we're in a good mood. When we feel good, we try to do good. Happiness is also subjective, so it means that it's to the person. So people who are happy with their life, that show more life satisfaction, also feel happier. Along with that, we also have objective well-being. So there are physical and economic indicators that help people determine quality of life. There is a certain amount of financial stability that leads to happiness, but being super wealthy doesn't change it. So literally having your needs met and not having to overly stress about finances makes people more apt to be happy. But being super rich doesn't really show any measurable change. And again, that's what you're seeing here. There's a point at which people start to feel happy, and then the extra money doesn't really mean much. Couple more things that we have to get through. Adaptation level principle. I love this one. This is the don't go big. So we adapt to the levels of a stimulus and need something even better to make us feel happy. If you start a relationship with somebody and you go big in the beginning, you better go bigger on the next major holiday or anniversary or important event. So if you start out by bringing someone flowers every single day, it's not the day that you forget that is going to be bad. It's when you try to celebrate their birthday by just bringing them flowers. Well, you've already done that, and you've done it a million times, so you need to do something more. Often, it's the little things that make us happy. If you start out with the little things, then the big things mean a whole lot. If you start out with the big things, then you need to go bigger. We adapt to the level of a stimulus to feel happy. So if a little bit made you feel happy, then you just need a little bit more. But if you started out with a lot, you may have shot yourself in the foot and you need to go really big. We also have something called the relative deprivation principle. In other words, we compare ourselves to others. And it's this sense that we are worse off than the others with whom we compare ourselves. We're relatively deprived in comparison. Now, hopefully you don't fit this, because usually we compare ourselves to people in similar situations. If we see ourselves in comparison to people in similar situations and we feel we're worse off, we feel relatively deprived. Good predictors of happiness, people who already like themselves. People who are optimistic, like how I shared with you guys how optimism should be defined. People who tend to be outgoing, and people who tend to be agreeable. They don't really get upset or feel like they have to fight everything. People with close friendships that have people to rely on. People who feel like they have a job or an activity that makes them purposeful in their daily life. Often meaningful religious faith, and this is because those people have the opportunity to see something like a chance beyond this life. And then getting good sleep and exercise. Both of those things keep the engine and the machine that is you running well. So we're going to end with happiness. And again, this is just something to kind of sum all of the happiness stuff up. Researchers have found that people with high self-esteem tend to be happier. However, age doesn't matter. So you can be 16 and miserable, or you can be 70 and miserable. But you could be 16 and ecstatic, and you can be 70 and ecstatic. Really, age doesn't matter. Again, being optimistic and outgoing, being agreeable, but again, gender doesn't really matter. So women have greater rates of depression. We also live in a society that allows them to express depression more, but they also experience more joy. So gender's not an issue. We talked about friendships and satisfying marriages. Educational level doesn't matter. You can be super happy without ever going on to college. You can be super happy going to a vo-tech school. You can be super happy going to grad school. You can be super happy getting a doctorate. You can be super happy, but education doesn't necessarily lead to happiness. Parenthood, having or not having children. Having children can make some people really happy. Not having children can make some people really happy. Children aren't for everyone. So parenthood is not an indication of happiness. Being pretty, being handsome, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're also going to be happy. So there are very beautiful people out there that live very sad lives. So those factors don't seem to have the same play. Now, this should be a pretty good summation of everything that you guys need to know. I know I talk through it fast, so please use your handout. Please come back and reference this a couple more times, flip through it. to get your answers. And if you have any questions, please make sure you hit me up on Remind or email me so I can answer them as quickly as possible.